Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony A9 Mark II. At $4,500 US, the A9 II is, in my opinion, the best sports and wildlife camera ever made. While it retains the same 24 megapixel sensor that we had in the original A9, virtually every other element of this camera has been improved and refined for professional photographers. Now, this is a review unit, like many of my products that I review here on the channel, but always, of course, I stick to what I find interesting. Never paid for a review, for those of you that are curious, never have been, never will be. So what is the A9 II all about? Well, it's taking that original A9, which was best in class with 20 frame per second autofocus, and improving upon it, something that I think most people didn't think needed to happen, especially with the same 24 megapixel sensor. But Sony was able to do it, and as you may have noticed, I've got the G Master 100-400 here and the freshly released 200-600 G Series full frame lens. And I've been using both of these on here, and I've enjoyed it, and I have a separate review, of course, of the 200-600, but focusing on the A9 II, it really takes everything that we got with the A9 and it just delivers better performance, which I didn't think was going to happen, but it does. So what's different? Well, starting with the sensor, even though it's still 24 megapixels, we do have a stacked sensor now with a brand new processor. And what that means is that we have better overall performance. It means better autofocusing accuracy. So, you know, it was nice to have 20 frames per second, but how about actually getting a 90% hit rate? Well, that lives in the A9 II. It didn't in the A9. And that's not to say that you couldn't get the shots you needed with the A9, but with the A9 II, you're more likely to get what you want. 3.69 million dot EVF. I wish they had gone with the higher res EVF that's in the A7R4, but we can't have it all. 1.4 million dot on the res on the LCD screen. So that's certainly a nice thing to have, and it does have touch capability. But what this is really about is that the 20 frames per second that existed with the original A9, you only got 5 frames per second when you went away from electronic to mechanical. Here, we have 10 frames per second. Furthermore, we have a revamped body with better weather sealing, better ergonomics. We have improved I/O, which means better throughput to match the fact that the processor now has, of course, been refreshed to give us better throughput for the actual autofocusing system. Well, now we have gigabit connectivity. We have USB Type-C 3.2, so latest and greatest there. Of course, a microphone, headphone jack, HDMI out. We also have Sony's multi-port there at the bottom. These are all things that you expect. And this design, the entire design of this camera, is borrowed directly from the A7R4, which makes sense. But this camera does have distinguishing elements that the A7R4 doesn't. I mean, that is why it's distinguished from it. So in terms of those elements, I've already mentioned it didn't get the new EVF. Would have liked that. But what did it get? Well, it did get, as I've mentioned, the body design. The controls are virtually the same on the back of the camera. The button layout, as well as the improved buttons. By that I mean they are not as recessed. So that means a more robust feel and practicality when actually using it. The new joystick, all of these things equate to better performance when shooting in extreme conditions. So whether you're wearing gloves somewhere that it's freezing, you get the point. You're going to be able to use these buttons more effectively than you could in days past. The improved ergonomics mean that when you mount a lens like this on this camera, it's going to be a better experience for you as a user. And I have to admit, I was impressed that the 200-600 was not a heavier piece of glass. I was expecting to have back problems. I didn't, so that was nice. But let me continue to focus on the A9 II. The overall in-body image stabilization was also improved. We got an extra half stop out of it, so I find that to be beneficial, of course. And when you look at everything they've done here, it speaks to professionals that make their living with the A9 II, and we're doing it with the A9 before it, because it seems like everything is feedback from pros. We have FTP file transfer now with encryption. We also have voice memo capability if you want to do it with your images, which again speaks to at least what I think pros had given Sony in terms of feedback. We have 2 slots, but now they are both capable of UHS 1 and 2 performance. The buffer is still, still I would say fantastic, but part of that has been keeping the resolution at 24 megapixels. I imagine that had they bumped it up, they probably would have had to rewrite the book a little bit in order to get that buffer to remain as deep at well over, I think it's a little under 270 shots. So had the resolution gone up, I imagine they would have had to either say we're hitting the wall, which they did not want to do, or, of course, tech would have had to been revised. And I think that's part of the reason that we didn't see a new sensor. We just saw improvements on everything else about the camera. And that's been my experience with it. If you want to shoot portraits with this, of course you can. 24 megapixels is more than enough resolution, but realistically, if you are looking for more res, this just isn't the camera for you. If you're looking for sports and wildlife nirvana, you're looking at it, because that's exactly what the A9 II masters. In the video world, we do not have any video profiles like you'll find on many other Sony cameras, including CyberShot models. But of course, more likely, I'm going to point to the A7R4 when we're talking about full frame, top of the line. But at 693 phase detection points, the 425 contrast, they combine for best-in-class performance. And the actual autofocus, auto exposure calculations are literally 60 per second, which is crazy when you think about the computational processing power that the A9 II harnesses. And that may just sound like marketing, but when you pick it up and use it and compare it to the A9 that it replaces, it's very clear that it is fantastic. And the real-time tracking, as well as the real-time eye autofocus for both animals and human animals, is really impressive. I mean, the A9, not a slouch. The A9 II is just better in basically every facet that you could imagine. Beyond that, other things you should be aware of. I've mentioned, the improvement of the design, the improvement over the A9 when it comes to weatherproofing. In addition to that, they've really, I think, honed in on the fact that this is a professional grade camera, and an improvement isn't going to be just pushing out more pixels. The improvement's going to be in making it appeal to more pros. And everything that I've experienced, as well as read and heard from pros, absolutely reinforces that. I mean, I'm yet to meet anyone who's picked this up and said it isn't an improvement from the A9, it isn't worth the money. And that's because I feel like all of that noise comes from people that aren't shooting with it. Another great thing is it's made the A9 far more affordable. So if you aren't a pro, but you want that performance, you can now find it at a much more palatable price. And I think that's a great thing. And that always happens, of course, when cameras are replaced with a newer model. But, the argument that not much has been improved here, well, those people, they're going to finally be able to get their first A9, which is certainly a good thing. Another thing that was improved over the A9 was its ability to handle flickering. And that was an issue, again, that I believe came directly from the pros, because with this camera, if you were shooting in a stadium, if you were shooting in any large event, the lighting was not addressed by the A9, and it caused issues. That is something that was taken care of here in the A9 II, not on the video side, but at least in the still world. The lower vibration on the shutter is a big deal. It really is. And, life expectancy is still 500,000 actuations, which I think is more than enough for a piece of equipment like this. And it's all about those minor improvements that add up to become a major issue. The anti-flicker is really a good point of order on this, because pros were not plagued, but certainly it was on the forefront of issues for them. Now that's much less of a problem, even though on the video side it's non-existent. But remember, this is a still camera first, and that is reflected in exactly what Sony has addressed on it. The throughput from the autofocus to the ports I've mentioned, and that's really a big deal. Having the voice memos, having Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz speeds that are actually usable. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I picked up Sony cameras that I've reviewed, owned, and I won't use the Wi-Fi because it is straight garbage. But since they implemented dual band in their latest generation of cameras, Wi-Fi is something I actually use on occasion now. In the past, I mean, many years ago, it was nice to have. It was impressive. But because they kept implementing the same Wi-Fi chip for years, I just started to wonder what they were thinking. Or maybe they had realized that nobody was using the Wi-Fi, and then they realized why. And modernizing that Wi-Fi chipset, it goes a long way. And having Type-C 3.2, also a no-brainer. I mean, it's nearly 2020. You've got to have that. So I think overall, when, again, you look at all the things that have been added, to the regular user, voice memos, they're going to be like, why? Well, if it's part of your workflow, you know why. And every element of the A9 II is refinement and polish that is going to matter to someone who makes their living right here. Right here. And I say right here because these are two great lenses. I mean, overlap, of course, for any pro to use. You can go with the 600 millimeter prime instead of this, but I would argue that you only need it if you absolutely need it, because in bright daylight, this thing does a hell of a job on the A9 II, and I can't really see justifying 6 times the price for the 600 mil prime. I'm sure there are pros out there, though, that will argue otherwise. But overall, this is easily, in my opinion, the best camera of its kind ever made. If you're looking for the fastest autofocus system, solid video performance, albeit not in the realm of Sony's other cameras for a reason, and just raw speed that also is complemented by a new processor and, again, new connectivity, that's exactly what you're going to get out of the A9 II. And it's improved in every way over the A9 original. So, I mean, there really is not an area other than the megapixel count and the EVF that this camera hasn't been improved. And that, to me, is a big deal. And a quick walk through the menus. I mean, this is not going to be a tutorial, but a quick walk. And this camera's great. I do wish we had more resolution, because that would equate to being able to leverage APS-C so that you could get, higher res images with a crop factor, still not giving up the autofocus prowess of this camera. But that's just not going to happen until we get a new sensor, and that will probably be the next generation. And that'll probably also be when Sony figures out, a larger buffer for this autofocus monster. Until then, we're living in the A9 II's world, because it really trounces the competition, and it's just a whole nother ball game, not trying to be cute, when you shoot with this. I mean, I want this camera, but I cannot personally justify it because I am not shooting with this camera for a living. If I was, you better believe it would be an instant purchase, because why would you handicap yourself on something you don't need to? It's not a $7,000 body, and it does exactly what it should. It just performs. I mean, my hit rate has been, as I mentioned, around 90%. And the eye autofocus on this is stellar. I mean, that's just been improved for years and years now. And, real-time tracking is amazing with this, because it does finally have a sensor that can keep up. A processor that can keep up with its autofocus capability. And if you care about that jump in the mechanical continuous shooting, that's a big deal too. I mean, I tend to stay in electronic, and I think most people that will use this will agree. But 5 frames per second up to 10 here, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, I would say that's a big, big deal. But, of course, most are going to lean on the electronic, because that's where the 20 frames per second lives, and it does an amazing job. I mean, I really have no complaints about this camera. I used to, when the A9 launched, I was like, 24 megapixels, it's not for me. But knowing what you can do, of course, with its autofocus system was amazing. Now here, with the improvements that they've made, I was nearly sold. And then I remembered I don't shoot wildlife or sports for a living. And so as a result, I own the A7R4 because it is the best hybrid camera. And if you do want a landscape monster that can also do some of the things this camera can, it will deliver that. But at the end of the day, this is a force to be reckoned with that no one has challenged, really. And it's just in time, of course, for Sony to make sure that it's going to the Olympics in Japan in 2020. And that's another reason they had to refresh this. If you could make the A9 more compelling for the Olympics, you better do it. And that's exactly what Sony did. And so with the A9 II, you have a camera that, again, I challenge people to complain about it. The only complaint I've already addressed is really that they wanted a new sensor. And while that's important, pros know that 24 megapixels is enough. After all, why are you using lenses like a 2 to 600 mil or a 100 to 400 G Master? You don't need more resolution. You need the 20 frames per second that this has to offer. And I don't know where they'll go next with that. I mean, I'm surprised people aren't complaining it's not 30 frames per second, but we all know in the future somewhere that's where that rate is going to exist. But again, if you are looking for the best wildlife and sports camera on the market, this is it. You're not going to do better. And I know there are plenty of Canon and Nikon users out there that have switched over, and they've done so for a very good reason. This camera has set yet another standard, continued with that line of excellence that the A9 brought to market in its first gen. So I love this thing. Again, I can't justify buying it with my own money because I'm not going to earn a living from using it, but boy, has it been a pleasure to roll out with this lens or the 1 to 400 and shoot. And basically, I mean, where I live, wildlife is abundant, so it's a pleasure to use. And wish I could keep it, but unfortunately, it does have to go back to Sony. Any questions or comments about this monster? Feel free to post them, hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.